We are halfway through 2023, and I want to check in with y'all and share 5 of my favorite books I've read so far this year. So let's get into it. Book number 1 is Our Daily Bread. It's the biography of Norman Borlaug. Now, not a lot of people know this guy's name, but he's a big deal. He's basically the man responsible for defusing Paul Ehrlich's population bomb. Quick recap, in the 60s, the UN estimated global population was about to double over the next 20 years. And the trouble was, nobody knew where the food to feed these new people was going to come from. People in countries like Pakistan and India and many other places were already starving as it was. Academics like Paul Ehrlich saw this and pretty much threw up their hands and said, we're screwed. We need less people. Enter one plant scientist from northern Iowa named Norman Borlaug, who pretty much tells Ehrlich and people like him to go sit in the corner and let the adults handle it. The grain that he developed was so successful that it yielded enough food to feed the world, and his work actually saved over 1 billion people from mass starvation. Now, that being said, I have a few questions after reading this book. It's not all black and white as far as I can see. Some critics claim that Borlaug inadvertently opened the back door and renewed Western control of these agricultural markets in Eastern countries. American seeds have to be treated with American fertilizers and American pesticides, and this large-scale mechanization of India's agriculture has ended up putting millions of small farmers out of work. It's really sad, but it's a fact. Hundreds of thousands of farmers have committed suicide in India over the past 20 years or so, and we shouldn't take that lightly. Like all complex systems, there are trade-offs at play here, and it's a book that makes you think about the details of this important issue, and to me, that makes it a book worth reading. By the way, if you like this video so far, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Book number 2 on the list is Confessions by St. Augustine. This book is a healing reminder that we're all flawed as human beings, and the purpose of prayer is to become less involved with our own desires so that we can get more involved in asking God what he wants from us. Augustine certainly wasn't perfect. In his writings, it's clear that he wrestled with sin and specifically lust. He gets his mistress pregnant and then he ships her back to Africa so that he can marry somebody else who's richer. And then he goes into the priesthood and calls the whole thing off altogether. He's oscillating back and forth during his life between his devotion to God on the one hand and his natural propensity to desire and anger and the severe depression that plagued him. But he found relief from all that through prayer. And this book is really a series of prayers where Augustine starts out by asking God a question, and then he proceeds to listen for God's voice and search his own soul to try to find the answer. In one of the opening lines, he says, "I shall look for you, Lord, by praying to you. And as I pray, I shall believe in you." And if you don't believe in God, what I would say is attention is the precursor to our belief. We're all after belief and some truth of one form or another. And one of the lessons that you can learn from Augustine is that regardless of our individual flaws and shortcomings, attending to those flaws by making a practice of laying our subjective whims and desires at the feet of a higher order principle is the path that allows us to transcend them. And if you want some science that backs that claim up, then stick around for book number 5. Okay, so I have a lot to say on this next book. This one is number 3 on my list. It's called Genius Belabored by Theodore Obenchain. This is the biography of Dr. Ignace Semmelweis, a very important and very tragic figure in the history of medical science. If you don't know this story, here's the cliff notes. 1800s, there was no germ theory, so nobody washed their hands, not even doctors, and lots of people died from infection in hospitals because of this, especially women and babies who were dying from this tongue twister of a disease called puerperal fever. It's also known as childbed fever. In fact, street birth actually had lower mortality rate than hospital birth at the time. That's how bad things got. Doctors regularly went from an autopsy to the surgical table to child delivery back to back to back without any form of sanitation, and nobody batted an eye. Semmelweis, an obstetrician, comes along and he wanted to figure out what was going on here. He wasn't satisfied with the textbook explanation that science had to offer at the time. Theory was these 4 liquid substances called humors that supposedly made up all of life became unbalanced in these cases. They even chalked it up to the atmosphere and the weather and the influence that these things had on those humors. This was the established science of the time, but years of study and testing led Semmelweis to develop a hand wash technique that involved chloride rinses between seeing his patients. And he had everybody on his unit adhere to the protocol, and it worked. In fact, it worked so well that he basically eliminated the mortality rate for childbed fever in his unit. Thrilled with his success, he shares this work with the scientific community, and they basically mock him out of his own hospital. He spends the rest of his life trying and failing to prove his case, and ultimately lost his mind and died in an asylum. Now, he didn't have the language to get his ideas across in the way that we do today. He called these germs toxic organic animal matter. Not really a term that was going to catch on, but we use the word germ today thanks to Louis Pasteur, and Pasteur's work was influenced by Semmelweis. And I really learned two lessons from this story. Number one, trust the science makes no sense. It's not scientific. Trust implies loyalty and faith, which isn't part of the scientific method. The process is question everything, consider every hypothesis, show your work, and if you find something useful, ask another scientist to repeat the experiment to see if they verify what you found. The very motto of the Royal Society, the oldest and the most prestigious scientific organization in the world, is nullius in verba. It means take nobody's word for it. Verify the science. Don't trust the science. Now, number two is more to do with Semmelweis's role in all this. He was right. And today in 2023, we know he was right, but it was really hard for his peers to accept that given the dogma of the time, and he didn't help his case at all. He actually became really resentful and defensive of his views, even to the point that his own wife didn't want anything to do with him in the end. And the lesson I got from that is anger and pride make you a poor ambassador of your passion. You may be right, and you may be justified in being right, but what good is being right when nobody wants to listen to what you have to say? And let me know what you think about that down in the comments. I'm sharing my views with you, but I want to hear what you have to say about these ideas. And number four, it's the only work of fiction on my list. This is The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. This book takes a novelist approach to paint a picture of the life of Jesus as far more human than the biblical stories, and that caused a lot of controversy. The Catholic Church actually banned the book, and when the movie was made back in the 80s, companies like Blockbuster refused to put it on their shelves. But for me, as a person of faith, reading the book changed the way I think about Christ's life for the better, and it helped me to relate to him on a more personal and a more human level. There's two main themes the book goes back and forth on: his perfection and his humanity. Now go to church and you'll learn all about the perfection of Christ, the miracles he performed, and the sacrifice that he made for us. But Jesus was also human, and that simply isn't being addressed in the modern approach to Christianity. By focusing exclusively on his perfection, we're only getting half the story. There's a human aspect of his life that wasn't documented, but if you can imagine his experience as a man living in a broken world and the countless number of small choices that he had to make every single day to avoid sin, you can begin to imagine just how hard his life must have really been. And inevitably, what I realize is every single one of us faces those same decisions in our own lives. If that seems like something you're interested in, I did a full review of this book down in the comments where you can check it out. Now we're coming to the last book on the list here, and I'm going to dive right in and read a quote that addresses the science behind a claim that I made earlier in the video. If you'll recall, it was about centering our thoughts and our attention on higher order principles that allow us to transcend our flaws. And we're talking about a neurological process known as downward causation. This is the process of thoughts causing the brain to carry out certain functions. Here it is. We all prove that downward causation exists every time we carry out an intention. If a thought is a pattern of neural activity in a network, it not only causes one network to change, it can also cause other networks to change, to be plastic. If cells processing sensory events undergo plasticity and change, why then can't cells processing a thought change the connections of the cells with which they communicate? Obviously they do. We simply need to learn more about how this happens. With thoughts empowered in this way, we can begin to see how the way we think about ourselves can have a powerful influence on the way we are and who we become. One self-image is self-perpetuating. That's from the book Synaptic Self: How Our Brains Become Who We Are. It's by Professor Joseph Ledoux, and it's a great book that walks you through the neuroscience of perception and how our sense of self emerges during this process. So those were 5 of the best books that I've read this year. If you've read any good books, I want you to share them with me. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think. And if you're looking for more great books to read, there's some really great ones on this next video. I think you'll like them. You can click right here and check them out. Stay curious, everybody. Stay humble, and I'll see you next time.